The village square was alive with a curious crowd, the late afternoon sun casting long, lazy shadows across the uneven cobblestones. Jack Marley stood in the center, his hands animated as he pitched his increasingly unconventional plan to transform the Marley Inn into a ghost-themed tourist attraction. Around him, the townsfolk gathered, some skeptical, some amused, others cautiously curious. He could feel their eyes flicker between him and the old inn visible down the road, its faded paint and sagging porches whispering stories of a more prosperous past. Well, Marley called Old Mer. Grimes, the village butcher, from the back of the crowd, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Ghost stories don't pay the bills, do they? Jack grinned, undeterred. True, but laughter, a bit of mystery, and a touch of the supernatural, that's what brings folks in these days. And who better to guide them than someone who's lived with the spirits all his life? A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd, but it was tinged with disbelief. Eleanor, ever the playful poltergeist, couldn't resist joining the fray. A nearby metal sign rattled with a mischievous clang, causing a few startled gasps and nervous chuckles. Jack shot a quick glance at the sign, then back at his audience, raising an eyebrow as if to say, "See." They were eager to help. Among the crowd, Sally, the local historian, watched thoughtfully. She had been skeptical at first, but Jack's earnestness and the peculiar charm of the inn had piqued her interest. After the gathering dispersed, she made her way to the inn's back room, a place thick with dust and forgotten memories. There, surrounded by stacks of ancient books and yellowing papers, Sally settled in for a deep dive into the Marley Inn's history. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened a fragile leather-bound diary, its pages brittle but legible. It belonged to a young woman, an early innkeeper's daughter, who had lived and died within those very walls. Her accounts spoke of strange noises, flickering lights, and unseen laughter that comforted and sometimes frightened the living. Eleanor's translucent figure hovered nearby, her vintage dress fluttering gently in the drafty room. Sally looked up and smiled softly. "So you're not just making this up, huh?" she murmured. The days that followed saw Jack walking the fine line between ridicule and support. At the local pub, the Marley Inn was the subject of heated debate. Glasses clinked and voices rose in the warm, lantern-lit room. Some dismissed the ghostly tales as fanciful nonsense, while others admitted a newfound curiosity, spurred by Sally's discoveries. Jack listened carefully, exchanging hopeful glances with Sally, who had become a reluctant but steady ally. One evening, as dusk settled over the inn, Jack and Eleanor wandered its creaky hallways. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath their steps, the fading light casting long shadows that danced with Eleanor's flickering form. She gestured toward the old portraits lining the walls, faces that had watched over the inn for generations, their stories now intertwined with the living and the dead. Outside, the distant tolling of church bells marked the hour, a steady reminder of time's passage. Jack took a deep breath, the weight of his doubts momentarily lifted by the strange but comforting presence at his side. "Maybe," he said quietly, "this place isn't just haunted by ghosts. Maybe it's haunted by hope." Eleanor smiled, a glimmer of mischief sparkling in her eyes. "And a little chaos," she added with a wink. As the night deepened, so did Jack's resolve. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled with skepticism and the unknown, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of cautious optimism. With Sally's research lending credibility to the stories, and the town's curiosity growing, the Marley Inn's fate might just be changing for the better. But would the sleepy village embrace this new chapter? Or would fear and doubt snuff out the spark before it could ignite? Jack knew the coming days would test his charm, wit, and the bonds he was forging with both the living and the dead. And as always, laughter would be his most potent weapon. The next morning promised fresh challenges and surprises, but for now, Jack allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. The ghosts were no longer just his spectral roommates, they were his allies in a grand, chaotic adventure. and the town might just have no choice but to join in the fun. Jack Marley stood just inside the creaky front door of the Marley Inn, watching as the new group of tourists shuffled hesitantly into the dimly lit entrance hall. The scent of aged wood mingled with a faint trace of lavender, a remnant of Eleanor's favorite perfume, Jack suspected, though no one had lived here for decades. The old floorboards groaned beneath their feet, and somewhere in the distance, an unseen door softly whispered shut. Jack offered his trademark wry smile, hoping it masked the flutter of nervous anticipation in his chest. "Welcome to the Marley Inn," he announced, voice steady despite the butterflies. "Don't mind the creaks and groans, they were part of the charm." The tourists exchanged glances, some with excitement, others with a trace of apprehension. Among them was Mabel, the retired tourist who had quickly become an unofficial ambassador for the inn. Her bright scarves fluttered as she greeted the newcomers warmly, her eyes twinkling with the kind of adventurous spirit that had drawn her here in the first place. Jack led the group into the parlor, a cozy room with faded wallpaper and a fireplace that crackled invitingly. "Now, this is where things get interesting," he said, gesturing toward the old photographs lining the walls, images of former guests, long-gone family members, and, of course, the famous Eleanor, whose translucent figure often appeared in one vintage portrait, her eyes mischievous even in stillness. As the tour began, Jack recounted the history of the inn, weaving in tales of the spirits who still roamed its halls. Laughter bubbled up as he imitated Eleanor's playful pranks, like the time she rearranged all the silverware overnight or caused the piano to play a jaunty tune unaided. The guests seemed captivated, their initial skepticism melting into amused curiosity. Suddenly, in the middle of a particularly dramatic story, the lights flickered and then died altogether, plunging the room into darkness. A chorus of startled gasps filled the air. Some guests clutched each other, unsure whether to laugh or flee. Jack's heart thudded painfully. "Not great timing," he muttered under his breath. Then, from the shadows, a soft glow emerged. Eleanor's translucent form took shape, her vintage dress shimmering faintly as she floated above the floor. With a playful grin, she summoned floating candles that flickered to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The room was bathed in a warm, flickering light that felt both eerie and comforting. The guests' fear transformed into delight. Cameras came out, phones recorded, and laughter echoed through the darkened parlor. Eleanor's impromptu light show was a hit. As the lights blinked back on, Jack breathed a sigh of relief. "Well, that's one way to keep things interesting," he joked. Later, in the garden beneath a sky splattered with stars, the group gathered to share their impressions. Mabel regaled them with stories of her previous travels, her voice animated and bright as the scarves that swirled around her shoulders. The soft crackle of the nearby fire pit mingled with the subtle laughter that seemed to float just beyond sight, a signature Eleanor touch. Throughout the evening, Eleanor's pranks continued in gentler forms. Flowers swayed without a breeze, lanterns flickered with ghostly hues, and the air seemed charged with a playful energy that left everyone enchanted. Jack watched the guests depart, their faces glowing with excitement and wonder. The feedback was invaluable, the unpredictability was part of the charm, and Eleanor's antics, while challenging to manage, were a unique selling point that no conventional inn could offer. As the last car disappeared down the winding road, Jack leaned against the doorframe, feeling a surge of optimism. The road ahead would be chaotic, certainly balancing ghostly caprice with the demands of running a business was no easy task. But tonight had shown him what was possible when laughter met the supernatural. "All right, Eleanor," he murmured to the empty room. "Let's keep them coming back." And somewhere in the shadows, a mischievous chuckle answered him, promising that the chaos was far from over. The Marley Inn was alive once again, and so was Jack's hope. But as the nights grew busier and the specters more spirited, the question remained: Could Jack truly harness the wild energy of his ghostly companions without losing himself in the process? Only time and a few more surprises would tell. Marvin Delaney's arrival at the Marley Inn was as sudden and unwelcome as a thunderclap on a sunny day. Jack Marley was wiping down the chipped counter in the lobby when the heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a man whose presence sucked the warmth from the room. Marvin's polished shoes clicked authoritatively against the faded floorboards, each step measured and deliberate. His sharp suit, tailored to perfection, seemed to mock the inn's faded floral wallpaper and threadbare carpets. "Me, Marley," Marvin began, his voice smooth but edged with menace. "I've heard quite a bit about your little enterprise here. A bed and breakfast, they say. With a unique selling point." Jack forced a smile, his mind racing. "You mean the ghosts?" "Yes, they do add a certain charm." Marvin's predatory smile widened. "Charm, sure. But charm doesn't pay the bills. I'm afraid your charm is stepping on some very expensive toes. My luxury hotel just down the road isn't exactly thrilled about the competition." Jack's stomach twisted. Competition was one thing, but Marvin's reputation for ruthless tactics was well known. "Look, Marvin, we were just trying to keep the inn afloat. No harm meant harm." Marvin chuckled darkly. "Oh, Jack, harm is exactly what happens when you start scaring off paying customers." The conversation was cut short as Marvin laid a thick envelope on the counter. Legal notices, eviction threats, and warnings disguised as courtesy letters. Jack's heart sank as he flicked through the documents, their cold print spelling out a grim future. That evening, Jack found himself in the cramped kitchen with Tommy, his lifelong friend and handyman. The room smelled faintly of burnt toast and old wood. Papers sprawled across the table like a battlefield map. "Well," Tommy said, scratching his head, "looks like we've got ourselves a proper war." Jack sighed, running a hand through his unruly hair. "I don't know if we can fight this, Tommy. Marvin's got money and lawyers. We've got, well, ghosts." A faint chill swept the room, and Jack glanced toward the doorway, where a shimmering light flickered. Eleanor's translucent form appeared, her vintage dress fluttering as if caught in a gentle breeze. "Did someone say ghosts?" she teased, her voice a melodic whisper. "Because I've got a few ideas." Jack felt a spark of hope. Eleanor was mischievous, yes, but fiercely loyal. Together, maybe they stood a chance. Outside, the shadowy figures of Marvin's hired men loomed like storm clouds. The local townsfolk watched with a mixture of curiosity and concern as the battle lines began to form around the Marley Inn. Marvin's first moves had been made, but Jack was far from beaten. With his spectral allies and steadfast friends at his side, he was ready to turn the tables, or at least give Marvin a run for his money. The Marley Inn was about to become a battleground where laughter, chaos, and ghostly pranks would collide with corporate greed and cold strategy. And Jack Marley, well, he wasn't about to let his family's legacy be swept away without a fight. As the night deepened, Eleanor's laughter echoed softly through the halls, a promise that the ghosts were far from finished. The real haunting was just beginning. "All right, ghosts," Jack muttered, a grin tugging at his lips despite the tension. "Let's show Mr. Delaney exactly what he's up against." And with that, the Marley Inn braced itself for its most chaotic chapter yet, a story where the supernatural met the decidedly earthly, and where Jack's quick wit and the ghost's playful mischief became the inn's last, best defense. The game was on, and the stakes had never been higher. Would laughter and ghosts be enough to save the day? Or was Marvin's shadow about to fall permanently over the Marley Inn? Only time and a lot of unexpected chaos would tell. The door creaked again, the battle lines drawn, but the spirit of the Marley Inn was far from broken. If anything, it was ready to fight back with a smile and a ghostly prank up its sleeve. And somewhere in the shadows, Eleanor winked. The showdown was coming, and Jack Marley was ready to meet it head-on. Jack Marley had never been one for peaceful days, but the tension that had wrapped itself around the Marley Inn like a persistent fog was something new entirely. The earlier part of the afternoon had been quiet, too quiet. Jack thought, until the unmistakable sound of heavy boots thudding against the old wooden porch jolted him from his paperwork. He glanced nervously through the grimy window, spotting two sharply dressed men approaching with an air of menace that even the usual creaks and groans of the inn couldn't mask. "Looks like Marvin's hired muscle," Jack muttered under his breath, attempting a dry joke that fell flat even to his own ears. He pushed back from the battered front desk, his mind racing for a plan that didn't involve running for the hills. The inn's ghosts, however, had other ideas. From the corner of the hallway, a faint shimmering figure appeared. Eleanor, the poltergeist with a penchant for mischief. She hovered with a playful glint in her translucent eyes, clearly ready to turn the intimidation tactics on their head. Jack caught her eye and gave a reluctant nod. If he was going to survive this, he'd need every bit of supernatural help he could muster. As the men pushed open the creaking front door, the air seemed to thicken. The chandelier above the grand staircase began to sway, a slow arc growing into a wild pendulum motion. Gas lamps flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows over the peeling wallpaper. Eleanor zipped through the air, her ethereal laughter barely audible but unmistakable in its gleeful defiance. The two men exchanged uneasy glances but pressed forward, their confident swagger faltering as the chandelier swung dangerously close to their heads. Suddenly, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind them with a thunderous bang, making them jump. "You're not exactly making a welcome party," Jack quipped, stepping forward with a mixture of bravado and genuine nervousness. "We're here on behalf of Miller Delaney," one of the men said gruffly. "He wants you to cease operations immediately." Tummy, Jack's best friend and handyman, appeared from the side hallway, wiping grease off his hands. "Well, I'm afraid you're a bit late," he said, cracking his knuckles. "The Marley Inn isn't going anywhere." The confrontation quickly descended into chaos, with Eleanor orchestrating a series of supernatural pranks that left the men scrambling. A loose floorboard gave way beneath one. A sudden cold draft seemed to push another into a rack of old china that shattered spectacularly. Each mishap was accompanied by Eleanor's mischievous giggles and Jack's increasingly breathless commentary. "Careful where you step!" Jack shouted, ducking as a flying teapot narrowly missed his head. This place has a mind of its own. Despite the mayhem, the men tried to maintain their composure, but it was clear their confidence was eroding fast. Tummy's quick thinking and handy repairs turned potential hazards into traps, while Jack's sarcastic remarks kept morale surprisingly high. As the last of the hired troublemakers stumbled out of the inn, disheveled and muttering curses, Jack leaned against the doorframe, his heart pounding but his grin wide. "That went better than expected," he admitted, sharing a triumphant look with Eleanor, who gave him a spectral thumbs up. The pressure from Marvin Delaney was mounting, yet tonight had proven one thing: the inn and its ghostly inhabitants were not so easily driven away. Jack felt a newfound surge of determination pulse through him, bolstered by the chaotic camaraderie he shared with the unseen forces that called the Marley Inn home. But as the night deepened, Jack knew this was only the beginning. Marvin's threats would escalate, and the battles ahead would test every ounce of his resilience and wit. Still, with laughter and ghosts on his side, Jack was ready to face whatever came next. "All right, Eleanor," he said, rubbing the back of his neck and smiling tiredly. "Let's show them what the Marley Inn's really made of." Outside, the wind howled softly, carrying with it the promise of more mischief, more chaos, and if Jack was lucky, more laughter. And somehow that was enough. The night drew on, the inn settling into a deceptive calm. But inside those aged walls, a plan was already taking shape, a plan born from desperation, hope, and a mischievous poltergeist's grin. Jack Marley was learning that sometimes the best defense was a good offense, especially when your allies were ghosts who loved a good prank just as much as he did. The battle lines had been drawn, laughter and chaos ready to meet greed and intimidation head-on. and Jack, for the first time in a long time, felt ready. The Marley Inn was far from finished. Jack Marley sat on the creaky sofa in the Marley Inn's parlor, a notebook balanced on his knee and a pen poised in his hand. Around him, the room was a patchwork of peeling wallpaper, faded upholstery, and the faint scent of old wood and forgotten stories. But tonight, the air crackled with something new, possibility. Eleanor, the inn's most mischievous poltergeist, hovered nearby, her translucent form shimmering faintly in the flickering candlelight. She twirled a strand of her vintage dress that fluttered like cobweb silk, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Well, Jack," Eleanor said, her voice a melodious whisper that seemed to dance on the edge of hearing, "you want to put on a show, don't you? Something to make these tourists gasp and laugh, and maybe, just maybe, stay a little longer." Jack grinned, scratching his unruly brown hair. "Exactly. No more just haunted inn on a sign. We need personality, flair, something that says come for the ghosts, stay for the chaos." Eleanor floated closer, her form flickering like a candle flame. "I can make things move, rattle, and sparkle, but we need more. Stories, history, spectacle." Jack nodded, tapping his pen against the notebook. "That's where Tommy and Sally come in. Tommy's practical skills will turn this place into a stage, and Sally's history will give us the stories that stick in people's heads." Just then, the door creaked open and Tommy stepped inside, carrying a box of old fairy lights and some hand-painted signs. His face was flushed from the chilly evening air, but his grin was as steady as ever. Ready to make this place look less like a haunted ruins and more like a haunted palace, he asked, dropping the box onto the floor with a soft thud. Jack laughed, standing up. "Let's start with the grand hallway. If we were going to sell ghosts, we need to make it feel like they were still here alive, even." Sally arrived shortly after, arms filled with dusty books and stacks of old photographs. She adjusted her glasses and glanced around the dim room. "Historical accuracy mixed with a dash of theatricality," she said, setting down her treasures. "I think we can spin some marvelous tales that will give our ghostly friends a real backstory." Over the next few days, the Marley Inn underwent a transformation. Tommy strung fairy lights in delicate webs across the ceilings, the soft glow casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Sally pinned yellowed newspaper clippings and sepia-toned portraits to the walls, each telling a story of the inn's colorful past. And Eleanor, ever the showstopper, practiced her spectral antics, rattling chandeliers just so, sending books to drift across tables, and performing a ghostly waltz in the grand hallway that made the old floorboards sing. Jack watched it all with a mixture of pride and nervousness. "It's starting to feel like a place people might actually want to visit," he muttered, mostly to himself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the inn was bathed in a warm, amber glow, Jack gathered the spirits for a final rehearsal. Eleanor pirouetted through the air, trailing shimmering ectoplasm like a dancer's veil, while the other ghosts joined in with playful whispers and flickering lights. "Perfect," Jack said breathlessly. "This is the kind of chaos that makes people laugh instead of scream." The following morning, the first media crew arrived. Jack stood near the front door, his heart thudding in his chest like a drum roll. The ghosts' giggles echoed faintly through the halls, a reminder that this was more than just a business venture. It was a new chapter for the Marley Inn, one written in laughter and light amidst the shadows. As the film crew set up their cameras and began interviewing Jack, Eleanor floated nearby, a triumphant smile playing on her translucent lips. Together, they had taken the first step toward turning a haunted ruin into a beacon of joyful resilience. But as the cameras rolled and the lights brightened the old walls, Jack couldn't help but wonder, would the world outside embrace their eccentric little haven? Or was this just the beginning of another ghost story, one filled with unexpected twists, and hopefully a happy ending? With a deep breath, Jack stepped forward, ready to find out. The Marley Inn's parlor was alive that evening, alive in the way only an old, creaky house full of ghosts and good intentions could be. Lanterns hung from battered ceiling hooks, casting jittery shadows that danced across peeling wallpaper and worn floorboards. The air was thick with anticipation, a blend of musty books, burnt toast from the kitchen, and an undercurrent of something decidedly otherworldly. Jack Marley stood in the center, hands thrust into the pockets of his worn trousers, his tousled brown hair catching the flickering light. His eyes glinted with a mixture of nerves and determination as he surveyed the motley crowd gathered for what he hoped would be a landmark night for the inn. The first official ghost tour event. Welcome, brave souls, to the Marley Inn, a place where the past refuses to check out, Jack began, his voice steady but laced with dry humor. Tonight, you will meet the residents who never quite left, experience hauntings designed to thrill and chill, and hopefully, leave with more laughter than screams. Or at least that's the plan. A ripple of laughter followed, the kind that eased the tension and sparked a convivial atmosphere. Among the guests was Mabel, the sprightly retired tourist, her bright scarves a vivid splash against the dim interior, eyes twinkling with excitement. Beside her, Tommy adjusted a lantern, ready with a reassuring smile and a few well-timed jokes to keep spirits high. Sally, the local historian, clutched her notebook, eager to witness history in the making or unmaking of the Marley Inn. The tour began with Jack leading the group through the narrow corridors, recounting tales both eerie and absurd. His storytelling was punctuated by subtle, ghostly interventions orchestrated by Eleanor, the inn's lead poltergeist, whose translucent figure flitted just out of sight, a mischievous grin playing on her ethereal lips. Without warning, the chandeliers above began to sway wildly, their crystals tinkling like laughter in the dark. Books exploded from shelves in a flurry of pages, swirling around guests like spectral confetti. A ghostly giggle echoed from the walls, and a cold breeze swept through the room, ruffling scarves and raising goosebumps. "Ah, Eleanor, you've outdone yourself," Jack quipped, barely suppressing his own grin as he steadied a startled guest. The atmosphere was one of controlled chaos, a carefully choreographed dance between the living and the dead that had the crowd on the edge of their seats, and often doubled over with laughter. However, the night's harmony was not destined to go unchallenged. Marvin, the slick rival hotelier, had sent a cadre of hired troublemakers to sabotage the event. Just as a particularly thrilling story reached its crescendo, the lights flickered and died, plunging the inn into darkness. Gasps and nervous murmurs swept through the group. But in the blackness, a new spectacle unfolded. Ghostly apparitions glowed softly in the shadows, their ethereal forms weaving through the stunned guests. Whispers of witty jokes and spectral quips filled the air, transforming fear into delight. Eleanor led the charge, her laughter ringing clear and true, turning a potential disaster into a dazzling display of supernatural showmanship. Tommy sprang into action, lighting candles and guiding guests with a calm confidence that steadied nerves. Sally's voice rose above the hum, adding historical snippets about the inn's past hauntings, lending an air of authenticity and depth. Even Marvin's hired hands found themselves caught up in the unexpected magic, their attempts at intimidation melting into amused smiles. By the time the lights returned, the mood had shifted palpably. Guests clapped, cheered, and exchanged stories of their favorite ghostly moments. Mabel raised her glass in a heartfelt toast, her voice trembling with joy. To Jack, Eleanor, and all the spirits who make this place more than just a building, a home full of laughter, chaos, and heart. Jack smiled, feeling a surge of warmth and hope that seemed to fill every crack and corner of the old inn. The night had been a trial by laughter, a testament to resilience, and the unexpected power of friendship between the living and the spectral. As guests lingered, reluctant to leave, Jack knew this was only the beginning. Marvin's shadow loomed, but so did the bright, irrepressible light of the Marley Inn's ghostly charm. And somewhere, in the flickering shadows, Eleanor's mischievous grin promised there was plenty more mischief and laughter to come.